The problem to solve in this video is based on the operation of an oxygen concentrator. So to start, we will learn about the basics of how an oxygen concentrator works. As we can see in the diagram, an oxygen concentrator has two molecular sieve beds. These are the ones responsible for trapping the nitrogen and letting the oxygen flow through, so we will be focusing on them. As air flows through the first molecular sieve bed, we can see that the nitrogen is getting trapped. And so, when this first molecular sieve bed gets saturated, the airflow switches to the second molecular sieve bed. This way, we can empty out the first molecular sieve bed, the one that's saturated, with a vacuum, and then restart the process again, and when the other one gets saturated, we change again. When looking at the inside of a molecular sieve bed, we can have various materials working together to purify oxygen, but in this case we will be focusing on zeolite, which is a common material used in these oxygen concentrators to absorb nitrogen and let oxygen flow through. Based on this information, we grab one single bead of zeolite. This is our proposed model, and from this we can calculate the time until saturation and when the molecular sieve bed has to change to the other one because this one is saturated. It is also assumed that there are no reactions and that diffusion is kept constant and in one direction, as molecular sieve beds only go from up down or down up. For starters, the initial conditions would mean no airflow, and so no concentration of either oxygen or nitrogen in these zeolite beads. And on the other hand, boundary conditions would mean that the zeolite beads are completely saturated with nitrogen. Now, to start on with the analysis, there's a key point that we're missing: the diffusivity of nitrogen to the zeolite beads. Now for this, a paper was found analyzing the diffusivity at different temperatures of nitrogen and oxygen through 5A zeolite crystals. From here, the analysis was based on an unsteady state process due to the saturation of the zeolite beads. Now, we can set a certain diameter of 1 centimeter as a reasonable measurement for zeolite beads. Conditions are now set. Parameters can be calculated in order to have the graphical method work, and so we do that, we graph, and we obtain a relative time value. From this relative time value, we can obtain the time it takes until the desired conditions. And so it was obtained that around 22 hours were needed for an 80% saturation of a single zeolite bead, which is a result that indicates that we must change the functioning molecular sieve bed in around 22 hours to diverge the flow to the second molecular sieve bed. It was also observed, thanks to the equation relating the diffusivity of nitrogen and the temperature, that when reducing the temperature, diffusivity went up, which meant that more time was needed until saturation when we had lower temperatures. This result is a good sign, because oxygen concentrators nowadays use a compressor and then a cooler in order to have lower temperatures and so have longer times until saturation and so longer functionality times of each molecular sieve bed. As conclusions, it is possible to say that results are somewhat viable, as this model is very limited and it would not be used in a real-life oxygen concentrator, in which sieve beds involve many materials, many layers, and different compositions of gases, but it still communicates to us the behavior of air in zeolite beads, and it could communicate to us the behavior of different gases through this material. It also shows that lower temperatures are favorable in order for the longer functioning of our oxygen concentrator. This type of analysis can be helpful in many areas, but especially in filtration, purification, and maybe environmental issues such as pollution or contamination, the release of particles and the absorption of some. But still, I say again, this model is very limited and more complex tools and analysis will be needed in order to determine complex results and applications in the industry. The difficulties when approaching this problem was mainly the very wide scope that it had that had to be reduced in order to be solved with the tools that were in our reach, and so to determine the appropriate solution method. Overall, this project gave me a lot of knowledge and applications in the industry and the complications and variables that these problems can have.